The book of Ruth focuses on two things that reveal our dependence upon God: land and children. And when we think about land, we typically think of dirt or matter that we, through technology, impose our will upon. But in the ancient Near East, land meant life. It meant provision and security. If you think about Israel's conception of the land, it's so important to them because God is the one who possesses the land, and he apportions it as a gift, as an inheritance to his people, according to different tribes and families. So land is something to be received with thanksgiving as a gift. It's not some object to be transformed into profit. And God nourishes his people through the land. It's through the harvests and through the crops that he provides and cares for those that belong to him. In a similar manner, God grants children as a gift. They're never spoken of as a nuisance or a burden, or most perversely as a clump of cells. Those are all corrupt visions of children. They're always a gift that the Lord brings. And everything in our modern world drives against this focus on our dependence on God. And both land and children remind us that we are part of generations, that we are not our own, that we're brought into the world and we will pass from this world and we will pass on our life through future generations. But again, everything in modern life focuses on the now. And land and children gives us a broader perspective. But even these temporal things, as good as they are not the final end. I mean, we learn in the New Testament that there's a greater inheritance, the inheritance of the kingdom of God, of new creation, the eternal inheritance awaiting for us in heaven. That's ultimately what these smaller temporal things point towards. And even children, it's a way of extending yourself into the future. It's the closest we get to evading death, and yet it doesn't quite fully bring us there. And that's meant to draw our eyes and our minds to the hope of resurrection, when we will have the enduring life through time that we crave and desire. So Ruth and the narrative of Ruth draws us into that fundamental reality, that God is our ultimate source of provision, of protection, and redemption. And because of his faithfulness to us, we can entrust him with all of our lives, knowing that he will care for us in our time of need. This is Understanding Ruth. The final chapter of Ruth in many ways mirrors the opening chapter of Ruth. We see an unnamed man, a kinsman redeemer, who withdraws from acting as a kinsman redeemer on Naomi's behalf in a way that mirrors how Orpah, Ruth's sister, withdrew from Naomi and said, you know what, instead of going with you back to Israel, back to Judah, I'm going to return to my people. So there's a rejection of sorts of Naomi, mirrored. There's also Naomi's concern that Ruth, who has decided to accompany her, find provision and security through a husband. And that is met in the form of Boaz, who ends up marrying Ruth and redeeming the land. Also, you see Naomi, when she returns home the first time, she's met with a chorus of people calling out her name, and it's a bitter homecoming. Instead of being pleasant, which is what Naomi means, she's bitter. She's Mara. But here at the end, the town rejoices at the birth of her grandson, at the fact that God has brought a child and redeemed her family. And finally, the emptiness that Naomi laments. She says, the Lord has turned his hand against me. He has brought me from fullness to emptiness. Well, that's reversed again, as she's brought from emptiness to fullness through Ruth, who again bears her grandson Obed, who becomes an ancestor of King David. And so that theme of reversal, of God's hesed, of his beyond the call of duty love, his faithfulness that goes beyond legal obligation, all of that is present in this final resolution. So this chapter breaks down into three sections. First, Boaz redeems Ruth and Naomi in verses 1 to 12. That's the main section. Second, God reverses Naomi's emptiness to fullness. That's Ruth 4, 13 to 17. And then finally, at the very end, we see a genealogy in which Ruth becomes the ancestor of King David. Ruth 4, 18 to 22. Let's look at that first main section, Ruth 4, 1 through 12. Boaz redeems Ruth and Naomi. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." The main narrative features two key scenes. First, Boaz chances, quote unquote, upon a nearer relative to Naomi's deceased husband, Elimelech. The author casts a negative light on this near relative by refusing to give him a name. He serves as a foil to the selflessness of Boaz, who eventually redeems Naomi's land and marries Ruth. In a prior episode, I mentioned how Boaz serves as a kinsman redeemer through Levirate marriage. However, upon further study, I want to amend that statement. Boaz does function as a kinsman redeemer, but does not engage in a levirate marriage, strictly speaking. And I'll explain that in a moment. But let's first think about that concept of a kinsman redeemer. A kinsman redeemer is a relative who receives the right to reclaim or redeem land sold by another family member to a third party. And this comes from Leviticus chapter 25, verses 23 to 24. "The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me, and in all the country you possess you shall allow a redemption of the land." So here God says in his law, all the land in Israel belongs to him, and he apportions it as he wills. So God ensures this social safety net for families who may have to sell their land out of desperation. For example, if a man sells his land to a third party, he may, when he receives more funds, be able to buy that land back, and he maintains the right to do that. If he dies, then a relative gains the right to redeem that property. So these laws not only demonstrate God's profound care for the poor, but emphasizes the land as a gift, as an inheritance. This unnamed redeemer, as a relative of Elimelech, receives the right to redeem the land. He can buy it back into the family of Elimelech. Now, Frederick Bush, a commentator, argues that the transaction occurs not over the selling of the land, but the rights to the land, because there's no actual exchange of money. And that's why he thinks that Naomi is not actually selling her land. She's selling the right to redeem it, or rather transferring the right to redeem it to somebody who has the income and the money to be able to buy it back. And there's a couple reasons that Bush argues for this that I think are persuasive. Elimelech likely sold his land before they left from Moab to a third party, which would explain why when Naomi returns to Bethlehem, she's poor, she's destitute, she's empty. She doesn't have this land that she can eat from because it's already been taken away. And she lacks the financial resources to exercise the right to buy it back. So she's completely at the mercy of a distant relative to take on the financial responsibility and buy back that land from the third party it was sold to. So the unnamed redeemer accepts this offer, says, okay, I will take the right and I will redeem the land. But then he hears the additional request by Boaz to marry Ruth the Moabite. And he withdraws. And the reason that he withdraws is he knows that if he buys the land, he can support Naomi, who's a widow. He can provide for them. But if he marries Ruth, then their child will receive the inheritance of the land under the name of Elimelech. In other words, it's going to be a financial hit to him and his own inheritance. And that's too much of a risk. He doesn't want to take that. And this clears the way for Boaz to step in. Now, why isn't this a levirate marriage? When Boaz comes in and they do the sandal exchange and that whole thing in front of the elders, why isn't that a levirate marriage? Well, first, what is a levirate marriage? In Deuteronomy 25, 5-10, there's a command that a brother marry his childless brother's widow to preserve his brother's name. And if he refuses that opportunity, the widow can publicly shame him before the elders of the city by removing his sandal and spitting in his face. Now notice, this is strictly for brothers. This is a provision for brothers alone, not distant relatives. Also, the sandal exchange has no condemnation or shame. Naomi doesn't show up and spit at the unnamed redeemer for refusing to marry Ruth. But I think the biggest argument against a levirate marriage is that one of the points of Ruth is the beyond the legal obligation faithfulness of God and of Ruth and of Boaz. Ruth is not obligated to marry Boaz, but she goes beyond the call of duty and marries him for the sake of Naomi. Boaz also is not required to marry her, which is a requirement regarding the levirate marriage. It's not an obligation on him. Also, for the unnamed redeemer, it's not obligated of him. He's not actually condemned legally for not choosing to marry Ruth, which means that it's optional. It's not legally binding on him. However, there is a moral principle underneath it, that it reflects the character of God to willingly take on the burdens of others. That even though he has no obligation, there's a sense in which out of the goodness of his heart, if he truly understands the land and the blessing of God and the character of God, that he would have married Ruth. And Boaz possesses that faithfulness. He says, even though I'm not bound to do this, I'm going to show grace. I'm going to extend myself outward the way that God does for me. And so again, Boaz is demonstrating the beyond the call of duty faithfulness of God. And Ruth, in her humility, shows the beyond the call of duty faithfulness of God in giving her life to care for this widow that she has no legal obligation to. And because of her faithfulness, because of her compassion, her kindness, her mercy, the people of the city praise her as a mother of Israel, like Rachel and Leah. Now, if you think about Rachel and Leah, they have stories intertwined that are very focused on children. And they go through great lengths to ensure that they have children, and there's not always the best, they're not always doing things in the most righteous manner. But Ruth is. This foreign Moabite is exemplifying a righteousness that even these vaunted mothers of Israel do not have. And the crowd also asked that God bless this new household of Boaz and Ruth, like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. Many commentators view a righteous reversal here. Ruth, like Tamar, demonstrates initiative to secure an offspring. So if you think back to Genesis 38, Judah fathers two sons, Er and Onan. Er marries Tamar, but then Er dies, which obligates Onan to bear a seed for his deceased brother. But Onan refuses to give Tamar an offspring by spilling his seed on the floor, which leaves her a childless widow. And Judah fails to really provide another husband for her. So she takes her own initiative. She dresses like a prostitute and conceives a child with Judah by deceiving him. And that results in the son Perez, who is actually an ancestor of Boaz. And here, that's not really the best circumstances you want a child to be born in. But you can see redemption. That the seventh generation from Perez, Boaz, and remember 7 is the number of perfection, is Boaz, who is righteous, who redeems that story in Genesis 38. And Ruth finds a way to bear a child for Naomi in a righteous way, not in a deceptive, sinful way. And so the initiative of Tamar is perfected in the life of Ruth. And the horrible situation in Genesis 38 finds a narrative redemption in Ruth and Boaz. So there's a lot going on here. But Boaz chooses to be a kinsman redeemer, not only to receive the rights of the land and bring it back into the family of Elimelech, but he also chooses, out of love for Ruth and out of love for Naomi, to bear a child. And in doing so, he goes beyond the call of duty and becomes part of God's redemptive purposes. Let's look at verses 13 to 17, when God reverses Naomi's emptiness to fullness. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So this narrative redemption continues when the women bless Naomi at the birth of her grandson, Obed, which means servant or restorer. The child, in a sense, becomes a redeemer for Naomi, who receives fullness for her emptiness. And she holds in her hand a living sign of God's faithfulness and provision. Furthermore, she gains an exemplary daughter-in-law who is worth more than 7 sons. Remember, the number of perfection. She is the fullness that Naomi didn't know she was bringing back. Remember, Naomi lost her 2 sons, but she has gained someone worth 7 sons in Ruth because of her faithfulness. And despite all odds, Ruth trusts God, her entire life to God, and takes great risks out of compassion and faithfulness to Naomi. Naomi left Moab empty, but returns full through the faithfulness of Ruth. She fled her homeland because of a famine of bread, but now returns to a full harvest, both literally and metaphorically, because of the quiet faithfulness of this Moabite woman. It's an amazing reversal. But that's not the end. We have in verses 18 to 22 a genealogy, when Ruth becomes the ancestor of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron, Hezron fathered Ram, Ram fathered Amminadab, Amminadab fathered Nahshon, Nahshon fathered Salmon, Salmon fathered Boaz, Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. Why are genealogies so important in the Bible? Well, it shows God's faithfulness through generations. And again, if we're only focused on now, we're going to miss that. But think about how many of the Gospels begin with a genealogy, and Ruth is included in that genealogy, because we want to see God's faithfulness, again, through broken people throughout history. Boaz not only comes as the 7th generation from Perez, as I mentioned before, but David is the 10th generation from Perez, which mirrors the 10 years of grief in Moab for Naomi, when she loses her husband, and she goes through that period of grieving. 10 years of sorrow are redeemed by 10 generations of fruitfulness that lead to the royal king David. Naomi goes again from emptiness to fullness, from bitterness to joy, from, one might say, death to resurrection. And this comes through the faithful God who goes above and beyond for his people, and through his people accomplishes his good purposes. God grants in this baby boy more than Naomi could ever ask or think, and she is considered his grandmother. And many generations later, another woman's going to hold a baby boy in her arms, in the line of Perez, Boaz, and David, the Lord Jesus Christ himself. And this is what God does. He lifts up the humble and restores the brokenhearted. He brings a harvest of abundance and joy from famine and sorrow. And he brings life out of death. This whole time, you can imagine Naomi, the emotional roller coaster, the moments of despair, And yet God is working behind the scenes to accomplish wonderful things for her. And that's the truth for all of our lives. That He brings us through the narrative tensions, the dramatic moments, and the times when we feel like we're up against the wall, in order that He might demonstrate that He is the one who spreads His wings of provision over us, that all of our lives are dependent upon Him, and that He has prepared for us an inheritance that will redeem all the years we have lost in Moab.